It's an enormous pleasure to have George here. He should have been at the Summer Institute years and years ago. And just as, to show you what that means, because our work is so overlapping that we just happen to have pictures of Kaldor and Hicks in addition to Robbins for our working stuff, and he's going to talk about Kaldor Hicks. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't have any slides. 0 slides. I did this the old. I didn't know the format and the layout of the room and all the rest, so I did this the old-fashioned way. I've prepared a handout on paper. So if you, I'll just give you half of those, and I'll take the other half of the other side. So if you would just grab that, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes before I get to this handout. You just take it past that. David's very kind to say I should have been here all along. In fact, I have no business being here. I'm not a history of thought scholar, but as you'll see, or as you will have already seen if you read my paper, that you'll know that's true. But the current project I'm working on is moving me in that direction. And so I'm just delighted to be here. And I have to say, it's only 2 days in, but I'm tremendously happy. I've been enjoying myself tremendously. It reminds me of the best of some of what happened in graduate school, to be back here with people who are doing such close textual analysis, which I have not been doing in my work, and listening to folks and reading papers where it's done so well really makes me long for it. So I have a feeling that the effect of my being here is going to linger quite some time after I leave. All right, this is what I want to do. I'm going to be talking about Kaldor Hicks, and you've got the outline of where I'm going there, though I'm not there yet, so if you did not look at it quite yet. I want to talk about the origins of the project that of which this is a part, and it's a new project. When I say new, I mean it's just brand new. It's going to be a project I think that'll carry me for the next several years. The project title is, in my head, is The Tragedy of Economics, because I think I've come to conclude that economic practice is essentially tragic. It's probably a tragedy that cannot be overcome. It has to be managed, and I want to explore that. This project, The Tragedy of Economics, comes out of my previous project, and so I want to talk to you about that project for a few minutes. My paper is really quite intuitive, so I think I'm going to be able to get through it fairly quickly. So I don't think by talking, so I'm going to talk for maybe 5 or 10 minutes about the previous project, but I don't think that'll interfere with our discussion of the project I present today. My previous project culminated in a book called The Economist Oath. And essentially in that book, I argued that economics is as a profession, is ethically deficient in that it isn't engaging in a serious and systematic way the ethical challenges that arise in the context of economic practice. Unlike law and medicine and several other professions that have spent a lot of time worrying about the ethical burdens that their practitioners face, economists haven't done that. And indeed, it's not that they've just overlooked the issue. Having gone through the AEA archives, going back to as far back as they go, the late 19th century, I found that this issue was raised repeatedly during the at the founding of the AEA and then immediately after and throughout the 20th century, various economists raised the question, where is our professional ethics? Where's our code of conduct? And the AEA Executive Committee took this up on a number of occasions and always resolutely rejected the idea that this was an area that required attention. And in the book, I tried to explore, I show that, and I tried to explore the logic behind those who claimed that we didn't need professional economic ethics. Largely, among other things, it related to an error in reducing in their minds professional ethics to a code of conduct. Economists opposed to codes of conduct for all kinds of reasons. But in fact, professional ethics isn't a code of conduct. Professional ethics is a tradition of careful inquiry into the difficult ethical questions that arise in the context of professional practice. I argued that we need this for a very simple reason. Economists have enormous impact on the lives of others by design. This didn't happen by mistake. As I think Eric was talking about with Cedric earlier today, Economists have sought influence over the lives of others going back at least to the founding of the AEA, say around 1885, and the profession has sought that ever since. I would argue that we've been wildly successful, about as successful as we're ever going to get. But we haven't, at the same time, paid quite, when I say we, I mean our profession, hasn't paid attention at the same time to the ethical entailments of having influence over the lives of others. In the book, I make a very simple four-step, or what I call an escalating case for professional economic ethics. And it's very quick and it's intuitive. I'm going to take you through it right now. I think of it as an escalating case because even the first step requires professional economic ethics, and then every other step builds on and strengthens the case. The first argument is simply the one I just mentioned. We enjoy influence over the lives of others, the people we purport to help. And we do this by virtue of an epistemic asymmetry between us and the lay people we purport to help. In economic, or our expertise, this is the burden of expertise. When you enjoy expertise in an area that's vital to people's lives, you necessarily enjoy some degree of power over them. We have achieved that kind of power, or what I prefer to call influence, and for a reason I'll get to in just a moment. We have enormous influence over the lives of others, and because of the language of economics, the way in which we speak to each other, the mathematics and the like, our knowledge is largely inaccessible to lay people. It's intimidating. It's hard for lay people to judge what it is that how economists go about doing their work. So there's an extraordinary degree of epistemic asymmetry over people, vis-a-vis people who need what we have to sell. This kind of monopoly gives us influence. Second point, and that point alone, if I had more time I'd go into this, necessitates that we spend more time thinking about professional economic ethics. The next point is that in recent decades in particular, economists have also come to enjoy institutional power. And this institutional power magnifies the power they already enjoyed by virtue of their epistemic, by virtue of their expertise. And I could list all the agencies and institutions around the world where economists now exert enormous power, but just think of central banks, which are increasingly independent around the world. Also the international financial institutions, and on and on and on. Economists are everywhere. They enjoy all kinds of institutional power, which magnifies their influence. Third point, and this is what I want to talk about today, virtually all economic policies entail unevenness of impact. You know, we're working on large canvases. We're not clinical practitioners dealing with one client at a time. We operate on a canvas where we affect the lives of thousands or millions all at once. And Hicks, of course, understood this. He argued that virtually any economic policy intervention that affects relative prices, which is to say virtually all policy interventions affect relative prices, quote, benefits those on one side of the market and damages those on the other. This is why, this is the background for his intervention about how economists should operate when they induce harm. In fact, I think Hicks is guilty of the over-recognition of harm. I may touch on that later, but I think his point is well taken. We should presume always that economic interventions, even if they go just as we want them to, are likely to have uneven impacts where some will be benefited and others will be harmed. Fourth point, epistemic insufficiency. And I want to return to a theme that was central to Scott's work from yesterday morning. Economists do not now know, and presumably never will know enough, to predict accurately the future impacts of their interventions. As a consequence, they have influence to be sure, but they lack control. They can't control the outcome of their policy. Even the best designed policies are apt to have all kinds of unforeseeable and unintended consequences, some of which can be beneficial. But of course, the point is that many of them can be harmful. When you enjoy influence in the world without control, when you have a lot of influence but you lack control, you, in some sense, are in the worst of all worlds, because then you're in a position to do a lot of damage. When I think of Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen, here's the image I have in my head. I think of a 10-year-old child behind the wheel of a Hummer careening down Main Street. And you ask yourself the question, does that child have influence over what's about to happen next? The answer is, you better believe it. Does that child have control over what's going to happen next? And the answer is, don't bet your life on it, and don't bet anyone else's life on it. It's the epistemic problem that I think is at the root of the tragedy of economics, that we will forever be operating in a world, or at least it's safe to presume, better to presume, ethical to presume, that we'll never overcome the epistemic problem. And so we always run the risk of causing harm to the very people we purport to want to help. And this, of course, means that we face an enormous ethical burden. What does it mean to be an ethical practitioner in a world where your best designed policies implemented by virtuous economists can nevertheless harm people? And when I say harm people, we all know that this can be a loss of a little bit of income, or it can be death. I mean, and the range is quite, we can all point to economic policy interventions that we believe, and we'd have different ideas about this, but we believe have led to severe hardships. All right, so I wrote that book making those arguments that we need professional ethics, but after I finished the book, I realized I'd made a fundamental mistake, which is what I'm trying to overcome now. I realized that I had fallen into thinking about harm as a simple concept. And I think in that respect, I am reflective of our profession. I think that we economists tend to have a simplified notion of harm. But when you start to think about harm and read about harm, especially outside of economics, what you come to find is that harm is an extraordinarily complex idea. It's not simple at all. It's internal. Well, I'll get back to that in a little while because we'll see that. There are all kinds of questions arise in the literature on harm that are not trivial, such as what is harm and who should decide whether someone's been harmed or not? What's a trivial harm? What's a significant harm? Which harms are ethically benign and which harms are ethically worrisome? What actions should professionals be allowed to take that cause harm, and what actions should professionals be barred from taking that cause harm? These are all extraordinary, my point, and I hope it's obvious. These are all really difficult questions. I'm going to raise a couple of others in a minute when I get to the paper, which is in 2 minutes. So the new project has 3 parts, and it's all about the notion of harm. The first question is, what is harm, and what is economic harm? What is economic? What are the harms associated with economic interventions? Second, how do economists cause harm as they try to do good? And third, how do economists theorize and manage the harm that their interventions entail? And that's the piece that I want to talk about today, because my argument is, or my assumption is, that Kaldor Hicks' compensation test is central to how we economists theorize the harms that we induce. All right, last point. This project is worry-driven. I'm driven by a profound worry, and that is that our profession has come to accept a little bit too easily the harms that are associated with our interventions. Not because we're not virtuous. I think there's something about the over-recognition of harm. We see harm everywhere, therefore we think that we can, it's not an interesting question to talk about how do we pursue harm-free policies, and I worry that that's led us to just be a little more casual about harm than we would otherwise, we ought to be. And I'm on the left, but this is not an indictment of my colleagues on the right. I think that were the left in charge of this world, it would be no better in this respect, because I just think that it's part of our professional ethos that we have come to be a little too casual about harm. All right, now let me turn, and again, this paper is intuitive, so I'm not going to have to talk for too long. The focus, the motivation for the paper is a special issue in a journal on neoliberalism, hence the example I give is neoliberalism. That's unfortunate for this audience because I'm sure people would want to argue with me whether neoliberalism exists and whether in fact it's as harmful as I worry that it is. But so I want to ask your forbearance and put that aside. In my view, when Jeffrey Sachs was running around the world in the 1980s, 1990s, helping countries move through his shock therapy, rapid, immediate adjustment to market liberalization. My worry is that it generated lots of benefits. I think that there's no need for anybody, including those of us on the left, to deny this. But it necessarily also caused harm. We could debate the nature of the harms, but I don't think there's any question that people were harmed. I would argue that you can't engage, and I don't care what kind of grand project you're pursuing, you can't engage in grand economic social engineering of that sort, whether it's toward liberalization or back towards state direction of the economy, without inducing serious harm. Adam Smith argued about this, the man of system. He warned us in TMS. He warned about the man of system who is apt to do tremendous harm as he tries to get society to conform to the models he has in his head. How were these interventions, and indeed virtually every other intervention in the last 100 years, defended, 80 years, essentially by Kaldor Hicks. The idea is that the winners could fully, the gains to the winners are going to be greater than the losses to the losers. The winners could therefore fully compensate the losers and still enjoy net benefit. Now, and that's, I teach international trade. That's the argument that's given for trade liberalization to this day. Most trade economists advocate trade liberalization, and when they do, the argument that they advance is implicitly Kaldor Hicks and sometimes explicitly so. Now, other professions also cause harm. I want to be clear about this. This isn't an indictment of the economics profession. It's just recognition that we're just like many other professions in that we cause harm. And some of those professions spend time worrying and thinking about it. Take medicine and medical practice. The concept there is iatrogenic harm. Iatros from the Greek, meaning physician-induced harm, iatrogenic harm. The medical profession takes this seriously. The medical profession works hard to understand the origins of iatrogenic harm and to manage iatrogenic harm. Iatrogenic harm is physician-induced. It can be both medical, such as iatrogenic infection, but iatrogenic harm can also be economic. That is to say, medical interventions can lead to economic harms, such as iatrogenic poverty. In economics, we don't have a similar concept. My argument, of course, is we need one and the associated tradition that goes with it. I propose the term in this paper and others, econogenic harm, economist-induced harm. And just like iatrogenic harm, it would have both economic and non-economic aspects. So for example, econogenic unemployment is an economic harm associated with an economic intervention. But you can also imagine econogenic morbidity, even econogenic mortality. The range of harms is quite diverse, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So the tragedy of economics, the claim is that econogenic harm is inevitable. We need to take better account, as Hicks recognized, but we need to do a better job of attending to it. Yes, please. Well, I'll take a couple, and then if it gets out, if I lose my place, I'll stop them. So please, Eric.
So the analogy between the economist and the medical doctor actually shows up in Richmond and others in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But I always thought, well, it's a bit complicated because doctors have an intuitively good grasp on human flourishing and are willing to talk about human health and flourishing in medical terms.
Yeah.
Economists really get very freaked out when they start talking.
I think this is centrally important. I mean, and
Are you going to talk about it more?
I will. In fact, I'll get to it very soon. I think this is an argument why we need the conversation about harm perhaps even more than does medicine, because some of the issues are more complicated here and more contested here than they might be in medicine. Yes, please.
Just following up, in medical practitioners can be held responsible. They can be sued.
Yes. Well, they can be disbarred. As far as I know, never. And that goes to a whole set of other issues about how were we to have ethical norms, would they be policed, and if they were policed, how would they be policed, none of which am I going to talk about today. But I deal with that in the previous book, because they're just complicated and important issues.
George, I just want to mention briefly, I don't want to interrupt you because Eric brought up the analogy between medicine and economics. I just wanted to point out when I was reading your paper last night, which I obviously loved, it struck me that there is a slight disanalogy between what physicians do and what economists
Yes.
do in the sense that, so okay, just so you're aware,
Well,
the
if you
physician operates directly on the patient.
Yeah, but think about public. I don't think of clinical medicine as the best guide, or clinical professions as the best guide for professional ethics and economics. But think about public health. Now you're talking about public policy interventions affecting large groups of people at once. The standard for what is a good outcome is still clear, as Eric rightly says, but now you're getting closer to something that looks like what economists do. Making decisions that often, in the context of public health, and I'm happy to talk about this later, benefit some at the expense of others.
I think what's interesting is that this analogy will actually serve your point because it complicates the nature of the relationship between the economist and his patient.
Yes, exactly.
It's even more of an issue that we need to analyze.
Thank you. Well, that's clearly my view. Okay. All right, so now I want to just talk about Kaldor Hicks. And again, I'm not doing any close textual analysis, so this is going to be quite quick. The Kaldor Hicks is essentially, my understanding, when I listen to economists advocating the policies they advocate and defending them when harm is involved, is that Kaldor Hicks, though it's not always invoked explicitly, remains the predominant strategy by which economists adjudicate between good and bad policies. There are other criteria, of course, that get layered onto that, but Kaldor Hicks still does a lot of work. I mean, many who operate with cost-benefit analysis tie it back directly to Kaldor Hicks, seeing their work as essentially operationalizing Kaldor Hicks. And of course, cost-benefit analysis is kind of the workhorse method for so much policy work. So I think it's really important that we revisit Kaldor Hicks, look at the assumptions and ask, is this really an appropriate way to think about policies that benefit some and harm others? Hicks himself thought it was a fully objective test. Here's what Hicks had to say. Hicks, this is from his Rehabilitation of Consumer Surplus, 1941. There's a perfectly objective test which enables us to discriminate between those reorganizations which improve productive efficiency and those which do not. If A is made so much better off by the change that he could compensate B for his loss and still have something left over, then the reorganization is an unequivocal improvement, end quote. The question that arises immediately in Kaldor Hicks is, do the losers have to be compensated? And should the economists play a role in deciding whether the victims of policy should be compensated? Hicks was somewhat cautious about this, but he described what his fellow colleagues thought at the time, again, 1930s. He described what he called the, quote, hard-boiled attitude of the economists of his era, which was, quote, to reject all compensation on the ground that such risks ought to have been allowed for, end quote, by rational actors. And rational actors know that harm is possible. They should have been preparing for it. Kaldor was but Hicks then went on to say, you know what, we make a mistake if we're that cavalier about it. He hedged. Kaldor doesn't really hedge. This is his EJ article from 1939. Quote, whether the landlords in the free trade case should in fact be given compensation or not is a political question on which the economist, as economist, could hardly pronounce an opinion. This goes back to Eric's paper of this morning. The important fact is that in the argument in favor of free trade, the fate of the landlords is wholly irrelevant, since the benefits of free trade are by no means destroyed, even if the landlords are fully reimbursed for their losses, end quote. I think that the question, should compensation be paid, even to this day, in the minds of many economists, remains largely a non-economic question. It's for someone else to fret about. Yes, please. Yeah.
Right? So it also reflects a continued understanding of what economics could be.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, helps your case.
Thank you. I don't have a pen to take all this down, but I will.
I think there's important ambiguity in the passage from Hicks where the last phrase was improvement in that one sentence.
An unambiguous improvement, correct.
And then the ambiguity is, I think what he's referring to is efficiency, not to welfare.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right, that's an important ambiguity to bring out. The claim is, and underlies about this, not making claims about welfare, but making claims about efficiency.
But this is really helpful, and I may track you down, because when I was pushing through this essay, I just couldn't wrap my mind around, I think ambiguity is exactly the right way to say it. I couldn't quite wrap my mind around what he wants us to think, both in that essay and the 1939 and the 1941 essay, because he does come to present it as the best available decision rule for advocating policy. That suggests to me that he's looking beyond just economic efficiency to welfare. He is invoking welfare there. He's making a welfare claim. And indeed, he's responding to, as is Kaldor and the rest, to Robin's concern about interpersonal utility comparison. He talks about it in terms of, as a contribution to the new welfare economics, and he uses the terminology of welfare through both of these essays. So the inference I came to draw is that he's thinking welfare here, related, of course, to economic efficiency, but really this is about welfare. Am I?
Very quickly.
Yeah.
What are the reasons against compensation? Very distort incentives?
that it could undermine the very economic efficiency that the policy was intended to improve. In fact, Hicks says if we're going to think about this scientifically, what we need to do is look at the policy absent compensation, see what the gains are, then consider what economic inefficiencies would arise were we to insert back in compensation, and it may turn out that with compensation the policy is no longer much benefit to anyone because the distortions from the compensation undermine the increased efficiency. He doesn't then say we should do the policy without compensation. I mean, again, Hicks is different from Kaldor, I think, in this respect. I think Hicks then says, then we need to worry about it, then we need to consider it. All right. All right, so let me quickly then, what I want to do, where I'm going, is I'm going to do some very quick discussion of the assumption set underlying Kaldor Hicks. The reason is because what I'm interested in is how do we theorize harm from within this kind of let's call it a neoclassical approach. Kaldor Hicks presumes consequentialist welfarism, where welfarism, at least over the last many decades, is thought of as preference satisfaction, where existing preferences are more or less taken to be valid. We don't do a lot of laundering of preferences and the like. We show respect to the people we're theorizing about by accepting their preferences more or less as they are. We treat all goods as welfare commensurable. The welfare that's, if you will, embodied in the commodity, though I know it's not embodied, but the welfare that's embodied in the commodity, or in the good, I should say, because this reaches beyond commodities, it allows us to make comparisons of one bundle of goods with another bundle of goods. Next, we presume completeness of preference ordering so that we can compare virtually any two bundles of goods. And if we then add on to that an extension of what we mean by good, say, for example, is a child a good, and so on and so forth. If we expand the notion of goods, we get to the point where we have completeness of orderings of all social situations and not just the goods that we buy and sell in markets. The assumption of continuity of preferences is carried forward here. It has to be, well, I shouldn't say it has to be, but it consequentially is carried forward, and this is very important because if we presume continuity of preference orderings plus a few other technical assumptions, we are led to bar from our analysis lexicographic orderings. And that becomes very important to where I'm going in a minute, which is all harms are treated as reparable. And this implies, all of this, extensive, if not complete, substitutability among goods. That's what we do when we move along an indifferent surface. We're giving up some good, we're getting more of one good in exchange for the loss of another good. Goods are extensively substitutable. Were they not, this analysis essentially breaks down. All right, this approach, the question I want to put before us is, what, if you make this set of assumptions, which Kaldor Hicks does, what kind of a picture of harm do you get? And the answer is you get a lovely, elegant, tractable account of harm. Harm is defined as the loss of welfare that's consequent upon the diminution of access to one or more goods. Harm is reduced to welfare loss. But I think we can say much more, given this assumption set. We can say that all harms are reparable in the sense that the harmed person can always be made whole, indifferent, restored to their previous level of welfare so that he is indifferent between the pre- and post-harm situations. This is vitally important. Repair in this model then takes the form of compensation. Compensation is universally available for losses, welfare losses, because under this assumption set, no matter what good we lose, there will always be other goods that can be substituted such that we are as well off as we were before. Otherwise, the notion of full compensation makes no sense. We have to get back to that level. We need to be made whole. So we're presuming not only reparability, but compensability as the mechanism. And if you take a quick look on the last page, and David, can you remind me, what time am I done? Just while people are looking. Okay. If you take a look at the last page, the figure 1, compensable versus non-compensable harm. David, could you just signal me 5 minutes? What I've tried to do here, and it's done in the paper in much greater detail than I'm going to do right now, is try to think through the relationships between the assumption set about commensurability, welfare reducibility, substitutability of goods, and the like, and the notion of reparability and compensability of harms. And the point I want to make at this stage in the presentation is merely this. Kaldor Hicks presumes that all harms reside in the northwest cell of this little chart here, that all goods are compensable, goods are substitutable, hence all harms are reparable, and they're reparable through a particular practice, which is to say compensation. Compensation in the form of other goods. For the purposes of my talk here, we can consider that to be money if we think that money is transferable into most other goods. All right, so harms are all reparable harms are reparable through compensation. The next point is that we find that we're in a world where we treat benefits and harms themselves as commensurable. That is to say that they reside on the same scale. There's some continuous scale where we can chart, say, the harms as a negative integer and benefits as a positive integer. And so what we're rejecting here is an idea that's very important in liberal philosophy, from Mill forward, which is the principle of harm's priority, ethical priority. The idea, we're rejecting the idea that there's something special about harm that has to be attended to very carefully, that we can't just add up harms and benefits, net them out and say, okay, I can harm David for his own benefit, or I can harm David for someone else's benefit. We're rejecting the idea of harm's priority. Moreover, and this follows a bit from what I've just said, we're also treating as commensurable those acts by professionals, like economists, that harm while they do good, and those that don't harm while they do good. Whether an action harms as it does good isn't interesting under this perspective. All that's interesting is the size of the net benefits. That's the key decider as to the key variable that allows us to decide whether a policy is beneficial or is to be approved or not. So there's no deontological or other principle-inflected reason for economists or, say, professionals under this approach to avoid harming. Net benefits is our concern. All right, now, here's the, it's perfect, I will be done very soon. Here's the, here is the frequent criticisms of Kaldor Hicks, you all know, and they're very, I'll just go through them quickly. First is the inattention to inequality. Kaldor Hicks, in the abstract, Kaldor Hicks doesn't attend to whether the winners are rich and the losers are poor, or vice versa. It doesn't pay attention to inequality. Many theorists have by now made this point. I could have listed a whole bunch more there. So there's the first point. It's inattentive to inequality. Second is the Kantian critique, that depending on the nature of the project, it can be argued that that Kaldor Hicks treats some merely as means and not also as ends. Mark White, the Kantian economist, makes this argument quite well, especially if you think about infrastructure projects in the context of economic development. Infrastructure projects often involve something like eminent domain, where people lose access to property they owned, or they lose access to common property that they have had ancestral rights to. The case under Kaldor Hicks, the question whether some are being treated as means merely as means to the benefit of others isn't an interesting question, but of course for Kantians it's hugely interesting, and so Kantians reject Kaldor Hicks on those grounds. The third criticism, this one's been made by Amartya Sen among others, is he says, look, Kaldor Hicks, we're considering a potential welfare situation against an actual welfare situation. We're saying that it's potential under this policy that nobody is harmed, therefore it's actually better to be preferred to the status quo. But Sen asks the question, on what basis are potential situations relevant to actual welfare comparisons? And of course his point is that they're not. I think that the best defense of Kaldor Hicks is what I call proto-contractarian or Parisian. Proto-contractarian because it fits into a contractarian framework, but as far as I know, no one has yet done the hard work of really seeing whether and to what degree Kaldor Hicks can be made fully consistent with a contractarian defense approach. And it's this, that the way to assess Kaldor Hicks isn't by looking at each individual policy assessment where some might be benefited but others are harmed. The key is to assume that a government that introduces one Kaldor Hicks efficient policy will introduce lots of Kaldor Hicks efficient policies. And the relevant question then is, how does each agent fare under a long string of Kaldor Hicks efficient policy interventions? And the claim is made that if we take a long-term view, say a lifetime, a person's lifetime, it's safe to conclude that everybody, this is the Paretian moment, everybody is a beneficiary from a system that's predicated on policy adjudication based on Kaldor Hicks. So in the long run, the point is there are no losers. I've given some citations and some quotations in the paper. I'll just read McCloskey because I love the way she comes at these things. Here's McCloskey's take on this from Bourgeois Dignity. Quote, it's a long quote, but this will be the last one for a while. The gain since 1800 from economic change has massive, and she's making this in defense in the context of policies that help some but hurt others. The gain since 1800 from economic change has massively outweighed in monetary and ethical terms the loss to English woodmen disemployed by Swedish timber, or American blacksmiths disemployed by automobiles, or Indian bullock drivers disemployed by motor trucks. The win-win-win-win-win far outnumber the lone lose. To put it back in terms of rule utilitarianism and constitutional political economy, and again, this is where the contractarianism kind of shows up. What sort of a society would you rather be born into? One that forbade every innovation that resulted in any loss whatsoever to anyone, and rested therefore at $3 a day, and held that the sun rose and that painting must always be representational, or one that allowed innovation, perhaps with a social safety net like Norway's, and resulted in $137 per day in income, and allowed Copernicus and Picasso to make old ideas obsolete. In this and other places in McCloskey's work, she argues that, look, the losses from each individual innovation, be it a policy innovation or an economic innovation independent of policy, is not ethically interesting or worrisome on the presumption, because of the presumption, that we will all be net beneficiaries in the long run from a series of Kaldor Hicks efficient policy adjustments. All right, the critical people here to read are Polinsky. Well, I guess Polinsky would be the best. I will now skip over the rest of these quotes. And what I want to do is talk about what would have to be the case for this argument to be true. And there are just 3 points I want to make. First, this case, the Paretian case, just like the case, the short-run case, has to presume does presume neoclassical welfarism, the commensurability of goods. It rejects the harms priority. Just like the Kaldor Hicks of old, it yields commensurability of all goods, reparability of all harms, and compensability of all harms. The point is this: even potential compensation requires the idea of compensability. If harms are non-compensable, then this whole argument fails. Second, harms, each individual harm has to be relatively trivial in magnitude relative to the flow of benefits that each of us is going to receive. Otherwise, there's no way to be sure that we're all going to be net beneficiaries in the long run. And third, harms have to be more or less serially independent, or at least close to serially independent. Not because of the contractarian argument that otherwise it's not fair, but because of the Paretian worry that if the same people are getting hammered day after day after day by policy changes, then there's no guarantee, the Paretian guarantee that everybody's a beneficiary fails. All right, so now you can see where I'm going, and I'll end on this. The Paretian case fails. It fails for a number of reasons. First, I would argue that neoclassical welfarism is not an appropriate way to make sense of harm. I've given a table 1 on the last page, what I hope is a usefully imprecise taxonomy of harms. And what I've tried to show there, and this is just drawing on lots of literatures, harm is really complicated. It's internally heterogeneous. It can be physical, psychological, economic, social, moral. There can be harms to our autonomy. And when we take a broad view of what it means to be harmed, you then have a hard time, not that it can't be done, you have a hard time reducing all of these to the welfare content of the agent. And indeed, reducing all these to welfare is dismissive of the actual aspirations of the agents we're theorizing about. I mean, this is Sen's point. Do we really want to put welfare achievement above autonomy in our assessment of whether someone's doing well or not? And of course, Sen and many others in many traditions argue that we can't, we should not. We do something fundamental, we oversimplify in an unethical way when we reduce all harms to welfare. So the point, harms are complex, they're diverse, they're not all reducible to welfare. The next is the scale of harms. The harms that result from economic social engineering, at least, are not trivial relative to the benefits that all communities are going to enjoy. This is clearly the case. Again, I used the example earlier of infrastructure projects. You build a really big dam and you relocate tens or hundreds of thousands of people. The argument goes by those who study these things that those communities are never going to recoup over the course of any reasonable number of lifetimes. So the scale of the harms that occur in the context of economic innovation or economic policy interventions can be massive. Next, the political economy of harm distribution. The people who get harmed today are very likely to get harmed tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Now, over several centuries, that may wash out, as Deirdre says, but it may not wash out in the context of the livelihood of any one person or one person's family over a couple of generations. And if it doesn't, then the Parisian guarantee explodes, and we're back in the Benthamite world of saying, well, at least the benefits are greater for some are greater than the cost of others. So we would need to have a political system that generates the harms randomly, so to speak, in order to be assured that the Parisian guarantee is held up. And then the last point. This is the most important point, but I think it's by now obvious where I'm going, so I'll just say it and stop talking. Not all harms are reparable, if you look at that list I gave you in the taxonomy, and not all reparable harms are compensable, and this is key. Economists have this notion that once someone's been harmed, anything that ameliorates the harm must be theorized as compensation. And what I want to suggest, and what I do suggest in the paper, is that that's just not plausible. People get harmed in many different ways. So what I want to direct your attention to is the southwest corner of figure 1. And what I want to argue is that when we have incommensurable, non-substitutable goods, compensation is no longer possible. But that doesn't mean people can't be repaired. But the repair happens through routes other than compensation, which means through routes that Kaldor Hicks is not sensitive to. So, for example, I argue that acknowledgement is the appropriate form of repair in many cases. Acknowledgement can take the form of public apology, the expression of public sympathy or gratitude, recognition for someone suffering on behalf of a community, respect and honor when, say, a first responder throws himself or herself into a burning building to save the lives of others. That person's death can't be compensated for, but the family that's grieving the person's loss can perhaps be repaired, at least partially, through respect and the granting of public honor. We have made the mistake, and when I say we, I point to Deirdre in some of her work, of thinking that whatever society does can be reduced to compensation, and therefore Kaldor Hicks still holds. But indeed, if there are non-reparable harms, or if not all reparable harms are compensable, Kaldor Hicks starts to fall away. So we need to be much more careful about when we use Kaldor Hicks and when we don't. The problem is we use it all the time. I don't think that that's ethically warranted. Okay, thank you.
Let me take Red Sea. What a surprise that is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you explain who those were? You did explain at the beginning. You lent me your photos
I'm
of.
working on Kaldor Hicks, and I'll talk about that.
Yeah, that's right.
Tangentially. But no, I think one of the things we talked about this morning was Stigler's paper against New Welfare Economics, which is to say it's against Kaldor Hicks. And in terms of the distinction George made, Stigler proposed basically a non-comparable harm.
Okay.
And that his policy, the proposed policy, was to pay thieves not to commit crime. He claimed that was efficient,
Mm-hmm.
and then say, no, we're not going to go that way. Why not? Because it violates reciprocity. So if you go back and look at the earliest attack that I know of on Kaldor Hicks, certainly Samuelson responds to at least 2 places, that you'll see where the profession turned away from that. Where the profession didn't go Stigler's route or whatever is embodied in that paper. And so I think but that we talked about this morning. I think in your way of thinking about things, that's going to be a really interesting moment. Okay, I'm shutting up. Okay. Oh, stop. Why not? Why not? It's a random assignment of harm.
I was going to ask I was going to ask a different question. was going to ask, well, maybe I'll still ask the original question I was going to ask, but just as David was walking the microphone over, an idea struck me, so I'll throw it out there. Does Kaldor Hicks, in the notion of harm always being reparable, assume the possibility of intersubjective utility comparisons? No? Okay, all right, then never mind. Like I said, it's just something that flashed in my mind in the last 15 seconds. So going back to this analogy that I pointed to earlier, it brought to mind Thomas Sowell's comment about the first law of economics being scarcity and the first law of politics being that they ignore the first law of economics. And so assuming that something like that is correct, it seems to me that the problem of improving the economist's effect on policy requires that we keep in mind the distortions, the ways in which economic theory is distorted as it moves through the political process.
Yeah.
Because that's really where the harm comes, is when it emerges from the political process, not when it emerges from the economist's pen.
Well, I would disagree. I mean, those are two different sources of harm. Those are two different harm-generating problems.
We need to worry about the relationship between them, though, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay. That's really
But, I'm sorry.
Actually, Sule was before me, so I'm going to...
Doesn't matter. Thank you. It's going outside this framework, but a major problem, it seems to me, is that in this framework, power differences, therefore political constraints, are not taken into account. I mean, even if something is compensable, it doesn't mean that the political process allows for compensations, and we see this in the aftermath of shock therapies. We see this in the United States trade policies. That's all I wanted to comment on.
Yeah. I think that's right. I'm sorry.
So you're talking about the transitional gains trap.
Say it again, please.
Sorry?
Say it again, please.
The transitional gains trap, in which the person that is harmed by a reform is not compensated because it's presumed that the reform is correcting an earlier error, but the new reform, those who are harmed by it are fully capitalized into the position that they're in. And so the problem of how to overcome transitional gains traps is long-lasting. A couple of other problems that come up in what you're talking about. First, economists don't want to abandon the Kaldor Hicks paradigm because it would severely constrain the amount of work that they could do.
Yeah.
That if we couldn't do a cost-benefit analysis,
right.
we would half of us be out of a job. Yes, that would be an irreparable harm. Well, we're fully capitalized into it, at least some of us more than others. The next problem that we have is that any policy change has to then pass through, as Soler was saying, through the political process before it actually gets put into place. But when it passes through the political process, the transfers to the losers, right, then suffer from a rent-seeking problem. So, for example, if we abolish slavery and we offer to compensate the holders of the slaves, then those who had held slaves now have an incentive to engage in a rent-seeking game to capture larger portions of the compensation. That part of the analysis is never included in the cost-benefit analysis. And so if you were to attach that to welfare, net welfare would be more negative than is usually measured. And besides that, also harms are often just not counted. when we do cost-benefit analysis. I was at the International Trade Commission when we were doing a study on intellectual property rights and abuses, dumping problems from China, and the survey was done of American producers of goods. Were they harmed, and to what amount, by dumping from Chinese producers? I asked the people who were managing the survey, were they also going to survey consumers on the benefit that they received from getting cheaper products? And the answer, of course, was no. We're not trying to protect them. And then finally, a lot of the losers are unobserved due to survivorship bias, which is something that you touched on as well, right? Those that lose, particularly if there's a bias in which parties get harmed, and the same ones are getting harmed over and over and over again, they're most likely to not survive and then not be observed in the final accounting of whether the policy was effective. And one last thought. Now, David and Sandra have a piece on that kind of takes the usual curves of the cost-benefit analysis and projects them onto the quantity axis. And then the median individual is the arbiter of whether or not the policy passes. To take that one step farther, if all policy changes are imaginatively, if this were even possible, effected through referendum, then there could be bargaining amongst those that would be harmed or benefited by all the particular policies, and they could do Coasian exchanges such that all of them did net out well, right? And that ameliorates the problem that the curves that we assume that we can measure for the cost-benefit analysis, we can't actually measure those. There's a measurement problem at the very beginning of the problem, right? We don't actually know where those curves are.
Right.
And we take that assumption from the beginning. But we can actually reach a more efficient solution if individuals are allowed to engage in exchange over those issues themselves.
Right. I agree. And, you know, so people like Des Gasper, he's an ethicist, he's an economist, development economist, deeply concerned about ethical issues in the context of, well, development. You know, he argues for a human rights approach to thinking about development projects that are going to have, let's take a dam again, just there's going to have massive destructive consequences for communities, arguing that they have to be they have to be given a real seat at the table to negotiate over what they can and can't live with, and if, to the degree that they're going to be harmed, nevertheless, what is it that they would accept as in response? Compensation could be part of it, but there can be so many other things that are equally or more important that are vital to the survival of the community and the health and the well-being of the community. So engagement, so the idea is that rather than having the economist over there doing the math, the communities themselves have got to be involved in doing the math to the degree that the math can be done. So, and I think that's right.
Thank you for a very interesting talk and paper. So I have two comments.
I don't know.
First, you mentioned the contractarian solution or discussion about this problem, but you didn't mention Buchanan and the calculus of consent,
Right.
which to a large extent tries to address precisely this problem. And related to this, one thing that comes out of that literature is the idea that you don't necessarily need to compensate people, you just need to have, to give them the right to exit. So that leads you to a description of why you should have this kind of federal system, you should have more decentralization than you currently have. So people will, if people have small costs of exit, then they would just self-select if they think they are overly harmed.
I think this point is enormously important to the whole project that I'm working on. But I mean in every single part of what I'm working on. So for example, if we are in a world of epistemic insufficiency, where our interventions can cause harm, then maybe it's prudent to operate on really small canvases and not on huge canvases. Well, one way to do that is through governance decentralization, where there's lots and lots of, letting 1,000 experiments flow. A number of them are going to fail, but if they're small scale interventions, there are exit options which, well, it does a number of things. It reduces the extent of the harm, the number of people in the first instance harmed. It reduces the extent of the harm to each individual because they might be able to escape. 3, it makes the harm less coercive. That is to say, the regime that brings about the harm is less coercive to those who will be harmed to the degree that they have exit options. So, and I think exit options is really centrally important to the idea about what does it mean. Well, okay, I'm just going to repeat myself, I'm sorry. So I agree with you on every level. I think it's really massively important, and I've got a lot of work to do there. I mentioned I'm on the left, and yet I spend more time these days reading Austrians than my brethren on the left. It's disturbing to me.
Yeah. So the theory there would be the theory of the compound republic by Vincent Ostrom that take this. So my second comment, I'm pretty sure you won't agree with it.
Okay.
So I want to challenge you on the idea that there are harms that are outside of the compensable harms box. So I think you may take, you may not be sufficiently cynic about the way in which people operate. So for example, why do we honor dead soldiers? So let me put a hypothesis to you that it may be just a lot cheaper than just actually compensating the family. So we kind of try to get away, we invent all sorts of mechanisms to get away from actually compensating. So that might be it. And let me tell you an anecdote that Walter Williams tells about this kind of problem. So he says that at one point he was late getting home, and when he got home, his wife was worried. You know, where have you been? I thought you had an accident or something. And his reaction was to say, well, it seems that my life insurance is not high enough. So,
I don't think all harms are compensable. I do not. I mean, it doesn't. The argument just strikes me as wrong. Doesn't mean my feelings should persuade you. I get that, but there's something about that argument. Of course, societies might find ways to, honoring dead soldiers is cheaper than giving payment. I get that, but even if that's the strategy, it doesn't prove the point that harm is compensable. I think that we need to be really careful about, I think we'd be better off erring on the side of presuming that some harms are not compensable than making the error of presuming that all of them are. I think we have a duty to those we purport to serve to make that, to have that bias until proven otherwise. I don't think it has been proven otherwise. I get the stories. The stories make perfect sense, but that's not proof either. When you're in position to cause harm, I think the default position, the ethically right default position is to presume that some of those harms may be irreparable, and so you'd better be damn careful. And it doesn't adjudicate the argument, but that's my bias, is what I'm trying to explain.
So, George, thank you very much for the presentation. I fully agree with you that harm is a multi-layered phenomenon, as I grew up in Bulgaria in the 90s, and I buy the story. But I feel uneasy about the beginning of the talk when you started with Jeffrey Sachs and shock therapy. I mean, when you have such a transition phenomenon, it's a one-shot game. It's mostly a centralized country, so no federalism, no exit option. You have no political system which is functioning so that it can distribute whatever, and you actually don't also have a civic society.
Right.
So I do believe that the story is relevant, but I don't think it's relevant for ruptures like transition. So I would not address it as at Sachs and people like him.
This, you can help me. Where do we draw the line? What about Greece now? It's not. I mean, so it does have a civil society. It's got a government. It's got all kinds of institutions. What about the what do you call it? Policy.
Austerity.
Thank you. What about austerity in Greece? Is that on the other side of the line from Bulgaria or from Russia? And where do we make that distinction between The cases where the rules should apply, some set of rules, I don't know what they are, should apply, and other cases where we're essentially emergency room doctors doing whatever it takes without prior informed consent to save a life. I know that's the image that Jeffrey wants, that Sachs wants us to have when we think about Russia. Okay, but what about Greece today? Where do we draw that line?
Well, first of all, I don't agree that Greece is an austerity regime currently, but
Okay.
and second, I would, since I know Greece from the neighborhood, actually I wish them more shock therapy than they have had, because I believe that systems like 1989 or Greece currently can only be solved by a shock.
Okay.
I mean, you can see the traps of gradualism in Hungary and many other transition countries, which have avoided the shock therapy and have got into quite a malfunctioning political system.
But what about China?
Well, of course, this is always a success story, but I just wanted to say that you don't have these compensation mechanisms.
Yeah.
And so I would just skip the transition case as an application, at least in the beginning.
Jeffrey Sachs is interesting to me because not just the economics of shock therapy, but the political aspect. He wanted to get the job done before those who were going to be harmed could mobilize to slow down the juggernaut. And that was his hope. And that's exactly how he speaks when he, you know, in the speeches he gave in Poland and Russia and elsewhere. We need to do the job before. He had this way of, and this worries me about our profession as well, of dehumanizing those who were going to get hurt, so we didn't need to worry about them. So the politicians who opposed him, they were populist politicians. You know, so the denigration. The workers who were going to lose their jobs, they were special interests. We use this language to decide who we should care about and who we shouldn't care about. We should care about those who are on the right side of history, not worry so much about those on the wrong side. That's what's interesting to me about Jeffrey Sachs, not necessarily the content of neoliberal or market liberalization adjustment. It's that attitude that I think is really worrisome, irrespective of.
It's anti-democratic, but there is no democracy yet, so I don't see a conflict. It's yet to emerge, right?
Okay.
I'm actually on your side with Greece, but we're going to skip
Yeah.
there because I'm a Dutchman and Dutch banks are benefiting.
So you're back.
Right. There's a tacit assumption in your paper that I want to bring out and raise concern about, not because we disagree, but because I had a kind of epiphany the last 6 months that has made me worried about this assumption.
Okay.
What you're appealing to is precautionary principles all the way down. Right?
What I'm advocating?
What you're appealing to implicitly are precautionary principles. So on the one hand, you have the harm principles, on the other hand, you have precautionary principles, and you're appealing to Austrian public choice style sensibilities, where those are also widespreadly accepted. Unfortunately, precautionary principles can also be abused non-trivially. Give an example today, we are in a terrorism environment. Anybody now is a potential terrorist. Precautionary principles now tell us we should be proactive in hunting the potential terrorists down. And so we've seen that precautionary principles, rather than slow down decision-making, have actually been used to accelerate decision-making. And so it strikes me that this is a part of your analysis that you're going to have to start thinking about, because the proactive rent-seeking, bureaucratic, technocratic, political class, whatever way you want to understand it, is now using the language of precaution to mobilize activity rather than to slow it down.
I just want to say, I'm opposed to thinking of ethical behavior in terms of decision rules, whether that's Pareto, whether it's Kaldor Hicks, whether it's the precautionary principle, whether it's the Hippocratic principle of first do no harm. I don't think that that's I just don't think that that's the right, and this is what I wrote about all this in the previous book. I don't think that that's I mean, I think we economists, not you, not those of us in this room, but the economists want, you know, moral, what one critic calls moral geometry. And moral geometry, there is no good moral geometry that can adjudicate these cases, and not the precautionary principle either. So I didn't mean to suggest that I think that economists should do nothing. Unless they're absolutely certain that no harm will follow. I don't think that at all. The point is that's not possible. Preserving the status quo too, a million people have made this point by now, causes harm. So there's no harm minimizing route. The question is, what does it mean to engage the harms that we necessarily confront ethically? And that's a much more difficult question.
We have 7 minutes.
This will take just 1 second. Back to Jeffrey Sachs, you're talking about the compensation principle, then you're talking about public finance within a polis. I just wondered who gave Jeffrey Sachs the right to tell other nations what they can and cannot do. How does that relate to public finance?
Yeah. Well, of course, I don't have an answer for that other than to say that Jeffrey Sachs worked really hard at the Harvard Institute of International Development to insert himself and his institute into the development processes in the post-socialist era. Well, I think he thinks he's doing God's work. I don't know him. Maybe some of you do. So he's okay. I think for me, he represents our profession very well. He thinks he's doing God's work, and so he should be in Russia doing. He's the smartest man in the room, so presumably he's smart enough. He's not, because you can't be smart enough. That's the point. But he thinks he's got an ethical duty to go do these things. I don't think of it as rent-seeking. I give him. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
Okay, so 3 hopefully quick things. So first, just I think a minor historical detail.
Okay.
I somehow had a sense that Kaldor Hicks started off with the demand theory stuff and compensation. I was wondering about the origins of, but I don't know. But anyway, that's a minor issue. On your diagram, what comes to mind is there were others in society. I mean, you didn't really get into the counterfactual to economists doing things. One of the issues, if you look at your figure 1, you could raise similar issues about the court system and compensatory and punitive damages and so on. And they're doing the same thing. And this is another source of well, rents not only to economists but also to trial lawyers in terms of the possibility of things. But then a final point on this issue of a challenge that Deirdre of McCluskey has made to this idea that there's no, that some things are irreparable. It goes back to the precautionary principle. There was, we had a fest trip for her back in March, and one of the issues that came up that incensed some of her followers was Steve Landsberg raised the example that Deirdre gives of the optimal amount of crime in the south side of Chicago, and that there is an optimal amount of crime. And people said, well, maybe that's okay for an optimal amount of car theft and shoplifting, but what about rapes and murders? And Steve's response was, well, would you sacrifice 90% of your income to ensure that there were never any rapes and murders in the south side of Chicago? And the person said, well, of course not. But that's not. But that's the issue. Is if in some sense you reach a limit to how far you're going to go with precautionary measures, it implies that there is a limit to there is. But it's not fully irreparable. And the point is, there are policy choices we have to make about how far we're going to go to deal with these supposedly irreparable harms.
That point you just made, I think, is wrong. To say that there's a limit to how much people are prepared to pay to prevent a certain harm does not mean that the harm, were it to happen, is reparable. I think that's the mistake, or at least that is a mistake.
Well, why? Why is that a mistake?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that how much people are prepared to pay is the right.
If you're not willing to pay 90% of your income,
no, but I don't think.
Why is that not reparable?
I don't think how much someone's prepared to pay is the right metric for judging whether something is reparable or irreparable. It's a category error in my view. So we can ask the question, how much are you prepared to pay? But it doesn't give you the answer to the question, is it reparable or is it not reparable? It might give you an answer to how much does someone want to avert that harm? Sure. And you can then compare how much they want to avert this harm as opposed to that harm. You can make relative judgments, but it's not the right metric, if there is one, for answering the question, is a harm reparable?
What's the metric then? Is there a metric?
Well, I mean, in law, I mean, we can look to. I mean, I don't know the answer to your question. We can look to practices in other fields. You mentioned law. In law, the idea that some harms are reparable, some harms are irreparable, it's contested, but it's a central idea in American jurisprudence that some harms are of a nature or of so grave, but let's say qualitative nature, that after the fact, no amount of money can compensate. The person will be irreparably harmed, and therefore a court should give an injunction until the merits of the case are heard. Now, there's a big debate in legal ethics, or not just in legal ethics, but in law, about what is the nature of irreparable versus reparable harm, and it's contested. So I'm not a scholar in this area. But how much you're prepared to pay, interesting, doesn't answer the question, is it irreparable? You know, a father who loses his child because he can't afford the medicine, and on and on. Okay, that person, is there an amount of money that would make that person bump him back up onto the same indifference curve? Is he well off with child and no money, or no child and a whole hell of a lot of money, such that he has been fully repaired, in the sense of having been made whole in terms of welfare? If we were to find a father who says, yeah, it's $1 million, this is the question that Raz puts, would we presume that that means that the loss of a child is reparable, or would we presume that that's a man who's got no business being a father? Sorry?
When the court system actually makes those awards, there's some implied statement of reparability when they're actually doing that.
No.
All right, we have one more question. How much might bid?
By the way,
Can I just make an observation? So Scandinavian ethicists have influence on global banking. So European and other export banks so now have to run their decision procedure now has to take into account when they build dams, the impact not just on the environment but also on indigenous people, et cetera. And just last week, a project financed by the Dutch Export Bank in Panama, 95% done, got halted because it was very clear that the procedures weren't followed.
yeah.
It wasn't even just checklisting, but it was just like grossly not following the procedures. And so it's unclear now what will happen with this dam.
Yeah.
People have already been harmed, by the way.
Yes, of course.
It's now partly symbolic politics. But it's just to say that the ruling, I mean, they're complicated public choice issues. But
Yeah.
the world is already moving partly the way to recognize that at least in those contexts, the old regime really was very bad.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're winning part of the fight.
Well, with that,
Thank you.
George,
Thank you all.
wonderfully stimulating.